Well, everything I've got about football, I owe to football. And the dedication and what I put into the game. You only get out the game what you put into it. And I put everything into it I could, and still do, for the people and for the people that I was playing for and the people that I was manager for. I didn't cheat them out of anything. So I put all my heart and soul to the extent that my family suffered. I regret it very much. Somebody said the football's a matter of life and death to you. I said, listen, it's more important than that.
Bill Shankly's quote has resonated down the years. The passion, obsession that shaped his words carried with it a universal truth. Football was no mere game. Not for managers, not for players, and certainly not the supporters. Across the world, football achieved the kind of fanatical support that most religions could only dream of. Yet from its inception, football's power to engage often proved dangerous, if not fatal. In 1583, Philip Stubbs, an English chronicler, wrote, "For as concerning football playing, I protest unto you it may be called a friendly kind of fight. For by this means sometimes their necks are broken, sometimes their noses gush with blood, sometimes their eyes start out, and sometimes hurt in one place, sometime another." By the 19th century, football had been transformed. The modern game outlawed the chaos of its predecessors and invoked rules which brought football into the mainstream, or so it was thought. For although the game had acquired a somewhat unlikely respectability, it was still infused with the bloodlust of old.
Certainly in Britain, hooliganism is around in the late 19th century, and as long as the game has been played at a professional level. Players were sometimes attacked after matches, and referees were literally driven out of grounds. And so hooliganism has been around for quite some time.
Packed stadiums also gave rise to concern. In 1902, 25 fans died at a Scotland-England match when the stand collapsed. 20 years later, when the new Wembley Stadium was being tested, few improvements had been made.
There is this rose-tinted view of the past, that somehow in the old days when we were all bundled together on the terraces, that everything was wonderful, there was this great camaraderie and everything. And of course there is a very strong element of truth in that, but at the same time we mustn't lose sight of the fact that once you'd paid your sixpence, that was it. The club didn't give a damn for you. It didn't give a damn about the conditions. You were just bundled in and you had to fend for yourself, and lots of people were injured. There were lots of heart attacks. Apart from all the great stadium disasters that have gone down in history, there were countless little episodes where people were injured and hurt badly.
Despite these dangers, fans around the world were filling stadiums. By the early 1940s, football had become the global game, and political leaders, deeply aware of the game's popularity, descended. By the eve of the Second World War, the beautiful game had been hijacked, caught in a crossfire between two very differing ideologies. During the war, 27 million Russians died. Few received burial, let alone the dignity of a marked grave. In the Ukraine, the toll on the local populace was devastating. Led by Stalin, post-war Russia sought to rebuild morale, and as such, published tales of wartime heroism which might sustain a weary public.
the death match was only one of many stories which were told to us as children about the heroism of the Soviet people, including ordinary Soviet people in the war.
Ну, мы знали ее, конечно, и у нас были и фильмы о футболистах, вот этих, которые участвовали в матче смерти. Было выпущены и книги, мы все это знали из истории, и, так сказать, они для нас были, видно, и образцом.
In 1941, Ukraine was overrun by the German army.
Raus! Raus, meine Herren, aber schneller bitte!
Several players from the top club side Dynamo Kiev were caught and imprisoned in a local concentration camp.
Gewehre! Lenkt an! Und jetzt spielen alle meine...
Unlike many, they were spared. The Germans formed them into a football team, which would play a one-off exhibition match against the Luftwaffe side. As a propaganda exercise, the match was a disaster. The Ukrainians were in danger of winning. And at half-time, an SS officer was sent to the players with an ultimatum.
Das heutige Spiel ist von besonderer Bedeutung. Zu gewinnen hat es die Mannschaft Condor. Im entgegengesetzten Falle werden sie alle erschossen.
The players defied the Germans and won the match. They were transported to the Babi Yar concentration camp where, still in their kit, the entire team was executed. The Soviet propaganda machine spawned a legend which remained unchallenged for many years. It was only in the death throes of communist rule that a bleaker, more complex truth emerged.
Немецкие войска вошли в Киев осенью 1942 года. Мне тогда было 9 лет. А вся команда, она содержалась в концлагере при хлебзаводе.
Despite being forced to work in the factory, the players were allowed to form a football team, Start FC. And at the Germans' invitation, a series of matches were arranged.
Что запомнилось? Запомнилось так, что на центральной трибуне сидели все немцы. Мадьяры немного сбоку стояли, венгерские войска стояли сбоку. Конечно, преимущество было команды, составленной из игроков киевского «Динамо». Они победили в этой игре. Во время игры было такое большое преимущество киевлян, что немцы хватались за свои парабеллы, стреляли вверх, а мадьярская команда подначивала их и кричала «Ой-ля-ля, ой-ля-ля».
There, in Kiev, they fought their little war against Germany. They beat everybody, and these games were really important for the inhabitants of Kiev, who were under occupation, because they were the only victory that, in those days, the inhabitants of Kiev could enjoy. As far as the outcome of these games goes, the Soviet version of the events was that after that only death match, everybody was shot. In fact, these games ended quietly. Nobody was shot after the last game, and the players carried on working mostly at that bakery. Then some of them were taken to the Sirets concentration camp, and eventually 4 of them were shot.
В феврале 1943 года там произошла такая, карательная акция. Немцы расстреливали каждого 5-го. Трудно сейчас установить причину. Кто-то говорит, что пнули собаку коменданта лагеря ногой, кто-то говорит, что чуть ли там не ударили или как-то обидели самого коменданта. Расстреляли блестящего вратаря Трусевича, который единственный из всех повел себя героически. Ну, не обязательно вести себя героически в смертный час, но его пытались положить, он встал, он крикнул: «Сталин придет, да здравствует советский спорт!» И его расстреляли стоя.
Trusevich and 2 others were executed, their bodies thrown into the ravine at Baba Yar. The victory over the Germans and Trusevich's brave words should have sealed their martyrdom, but instead they were vilified.
Надо сказать, что сразу после взятия Киева, сразу после того, как начали уже разбираться в 1944-1945 году, все футболисты, принимавшие участие в матчах с немцами, имели очень большие неприятности. В частности, я помню, что сестру погибшего футболиста Трусевича, расстрелянного, все время вызывали в КГБ, все время допрашивали, почему ее брат остался в Киеве, каким образом он играл с немцами.
They were not considered to be heroes because the world was seen through a very two-dimensional way, black or white. They survived the occupation, they played with Germans, therefore they were almost traitors.
While post-war Russia rose from the ashes, the surviving players were forced underground, their very existence contradicting the communist-sponsored deathmatch myth.
Their tragedy was that they were never allowed just to be themselves and to play the game they loved. They had to be the banners of Stalinism, they had to keep low profile after the war and pretend that nothing happened. So all their lives they were basically tools of this big machine called history and state. And unfortunately the state eventually didn't treat them very well.
The players had been eulogized by the state, immortalized on film, were supposed to be dead. Yet some had survived. For many, the death match was no longer a hushed tale of Soviet heroism, it was a fiction of communist invention. For others, it remains an enigma, best left untouched.
Опубликованы различные версии, опубликована и эта версия, о которой говорю я, но официальной, той версии, которая придерживается и общество «Динамо», и украинская, и российская, это то, что это герои, пострадавшие во время Великой войны за свой народ. И пусть так будет, люди погибли, пусть земля их будет пухом, никто не возражает против того, что они были героями.
In the post-war era, Italy, like the Ukraine, began to rebuild her fallen cities. Football, which had struggled through the war, became a part of this process. From 1946, Torino dominated the league entirely, winning 3 championships in succession.
Era un gruppo fantastico, un gruppo di mix di giovani ed anziani calciatori che vivevano per questo grande sogno che era quello di essere una squadra invincibile, imbattibile. Era una squadra che aveva dentro a questi uomini una forza incredibile, una forza di volontà, oltre che a delle questioni tecniche. E questo era il grande Torino.
Despite their reputation as a side replete with stars, one shone brighter than the rest. Valentina Mazzola. Feared by opponents and adored by the supporters, Mazzola was Italy's first modern superstar.
Questa protezione di quest'uomo che è stato il nostro capitano, Valentino Mazzola, che è stato proprio un grande personaggio del Torino, aveva verso di noi, diciamo, una superiorità tecnica e di giocatore ma anche di uomo.
Avevo 3-4 anni fino a 5 anni e mio padre mi portava come mascotte del Torino e avevo le mie scarpette da calcio, tutta la divisa con la maglia numero 10 e non capivo bene perché la gente fosse sempre vicino a lui, fosse intorno a lui. Pensavo che fosse una persona importante per come veniva trattata dal pubblico. Molte volte io mi aggrappavo alla sua mano per sentirmi sicuro, perché vedevo tutta questa gente alta, essendo io bambino piccolo, e avevo anche un po' di paura e la sua mano era quella che mi dava la forza.
Torino's success in the Italian League brought great wealth to the club and the players. It also benefited the national team. In 1947, Italy started their match against Hungary with 10 Torino players, a feat never since repeated. It seemed nobody could stand in the way of Torino. Towards the end of the 1949 season, Mazzola promised Benfica's captain, Ferreira, that he would take a Torino side to Lisbon for his testimonial. With Torino on the cusp of their 4th successive championship, the trip seemed harmless enough.
Mio padre non stava bene e non giocò la partita a Milano prima di andare in Portogallo contro l'Inter, e fino all'ultimo momento rimase indeciso se andare o non andare, ma poi ricordandosi questa promessa decise che non poteva mancare alla parola che aveva data a un collega, e quindi andò anche lui in quella spedizione.
Mazzola joined 30 others and set out for Portugal. Only Toma, who had damaged his knee, remained. On the 3rd of May, Torino lost to their Portuguese hosts. The next day they set back for Italy.
Da casa mia io vedo Superga, cioè la vedo nelle giornate limpide come oggi, ma il più delle volte non la vedo Superga. Ha capito? Perché essendo a 500-600 metri è sempre presa dalle nuvole. Io so come succedeva, si preparavano le valigie, si preparava, diciamo, ai regalini che uno aveva comprato per dare ai bambini, alla famiglia. C'era dell'entusiasmo quando si avvistava la propria città, e senz'altro sarà successo anche allora, e se non che sono andati a imbattersi in questa nuvolaglia, in questa nebbia che non ha fatto più vedere all'aviatore e non le ha dato la possibilità di scansare o di sorpassarlo. Difatti è battuto con l'ala e poi ci è andato contro. Ecco.
There were no survivors.
Io li ho vegliati tutta la notte a Palazzo Madama e sono stato un po' dietro questi corpi ricomposti, diciamo, in questa bara, in mezzo a tanti fiori, e vi dirò, ragazzi, che ero vergognoso dei familiari.
On the 6th of May 1949, Turin buried its heroes. While the whole of Italy mourned, one person remained unaware of the tragedy.
Cercarono, forse giustamente, di non dirmi subito quello che era successo, perché forse sarebbe stato troppo forte, uno shock troppo forte. Però fui allontanato da casa e fui portato a casa di amici di mio padre qui nella periferia di Torino, e quindi passai almeno una decina di giorni senza sapere che cosa era successo. Quindi l'ho saputo piano piano e la cosa mi ha fatto chiaramente meno male sapendolo pian piano, cioè ma papà ritorna, è andato a giocare, poi sai c'è stato un incidente e finché poi mi sono reso conto da solo praticamente che mio padre era morto.
While Sandro Mazzola would eventually step into his father's boots, forging a glittering career with Inter and Italy, Torino never really recovered, spending the next 50 years in the shadow of neighbours and long-term rivals Juventus. For those left behind, the void into which their team fell was as nothing compared to the lingering sense of loss.
Mi mancavano i miei compagni nello spogliatoio come mi sono mancati per tutta la vita, perché io faccio la preghiera alla sera e quasi quasi li nomino tutti quanti e così al mattino. Per me la giornata è opportuna, diciamo, perché ho il ricordo dalle loro fotografie, dai miei ricordi, così continuo, ecco, non l'ho mai potuti dimenticare.
The Turin disaster resonated throughout Europe.
Saying au revoir to London are members of the Arsenal football team as they leave for a tour of Brazil. Following the recent disaster to the Turin team, Arsenal travelled in two parties, and here are some familiar faces in the first batch. To them and to their fellow players we wish many good games on the other side of the world.
Air travel had become increasingly common, particularly after the European Cup was established. In 1957, Manchester United were England's club champions, a young side who, like Torino, were the source of their national squad's brightest talents. A year later, they flew to Yugoslavia for their quarter-final tie with Red Star Belgrade. United drew 3-3, but won 5-4 on aggregate. With a semi-final to look forward to, the squad began the long journey back to Manchester.
It was a snowy day when we left Belgrade, and when we got to Munich, it was the same, only maybe a little bit heavier. We got to Munich and then we went down through the clouds and the snow on the ground when we got there. And that, I thought, oh, well, that'll be it, we'll be staying in Munich by the looks of it, you know. Anyway, we went back to the terminal, and of course they were refueling the aircraft and tried to take off. And we thought it was taking off, but he went two-thirds of the way, and the brakes went on, you know. Then they stopped, came back, went back to the terminal, and tried again. Everybody was worried then, you know. I mean, it was something serious, wrong, seriously wrong, and we all could feel it. And we got back into the aircraft. All I could see was snow, and then it started again with a speed, and it started to go. And I could see the snow flying past, and bouncing around and jumping around. You know, I thought, this is unbelievable. I thought it's not going fast enough to get off. You know, it started to get off a bit quicker, bit quicker, and then a tremendous thud, as if it hit a brick wall. And then it went on again, it still went on. And then another thud, even harder than that one, you know. I thought, oh, if we have another one like that, that'll be it. That's what I thought, you know. And I'm down in my seat, flying along. And then, psh, blackness, I didn't see anything. Out.
The Munich air crash killed 23 passengers, 8 of them players. Like Torino before them, the tragedy placed an almost intolerable burden on those who were left behind.
My life was never the same. You know, suddenly all my pals were missing, and playing in a team that was full of enthusiasm and had the whole world at their feet. Suddenly you have to come back, and the club was struggling to actually survive even in the first division. So it did affect me a lot. It changed my life completely, really.
While Charlton went on to become a European and World Cup winner, many of his teammates were not so fortunate. Some of the survivors complained that the game had been quick to forget them.
We should have been paying more attention to the survivors and all the people who had died as well. And we didn't. We were too busy getting on with the game, you know. They didn't look after the people. That's when I got the anger, real anger. They were cast aside, more or less. A lot of it because they couldn't play football anymore, really. And some of the lads who played were suffering just because they were okay physically, I mean, not all mentally. But that's life.
While the events of Munich and Turin were tragic accidents, football has often inflicted its own wounds.
Y considero que el fútbol es para unirlos. ¿Cuántos millones tenemos de afiliados? Un mundial, ¿cuánto lo miran? Millones de personas, tanto presentes como por la televisión o por la radio. Y eso nos da la idea de que el fútbol principalmente es un vínculo de amistad y no de odio.
In 1970, El Salvador went to the World Cup. To get there, they took part in the costliest campaign in football history. Honduras and El Salvador had always been brother nations. Yet in 1969, relations between their governments were strained. Honduran land reforms had seen migrant farmers expelled from their farms. As a consequence, 300,000 Salvadorians had been forced back over the border into their homeland. In the midst of these tensions came a World Cup qualification playoff between the countries. Honduras won the first match at home, but then had to travel to El Salvador.
Realmente estábamos preocupados por nuestras vidas porque se había hecho mucha publicidad hostil hacia nuestro equipo. Y puedo decirlo con toda sinceridad que estuvimos prácticamente 3 días sin dormir antes del partido.
Nos llevaron así como en la Segunda Guerra Mundial, unos buses Volkswagen que había en ese tiempo, pequeños, como con 10 motocicletas a toda velocidad. Y en las calles estaban los grupos de gente tirando todo sobre nosotros. Y así jugamos.
Intimidated, the Hondurans lost the game 3-1 and fled the country. Visiting fans were attacked. 2 were killed. Passions inflamed. The border was closed between the 2 countries.
At 5:30 this morning, Salvadorian planes did incur again over the capital. The attack of Salvador have persisted throughout the night in all points of the frontier. They are being repulsed by the Honduran army detachments. We are the first to regret that this has been mislabeled a soccer war because it has much more serious consequences economically as well as politically in Central America.
The conflict lasted only 100 hours, yet claimed 6,000 lives. Around the world, people wondered that a war should be sparked by a football match, that such passions could be inflamed. Although for the players, the idea that they had sparked a soccer war was both repugnant and misleading.
No, nosotros los jugadores en ese momento no pensábamos realmente en que que algo así fuera concebido en contra del fútbol. Con el tiempo analizamos de que habían otras connotaciones realmente para esto, para cómo se llegaba a este partido. Los políticos se aprovecharon de esa situación, los militares se aprovecharon de esa situación. Es una lástima porque yo considero que el fútbol no debe ser una excusa para este tipo de problemas.
El Salvador and Honduras played the deciding match in the series at the Azteca Stadium in Mexico. The Salvadorians won the game, but were then punished at the finals. Their early exit, perhaps the only appropriate outcome to an event that edified neither football nor the countries involved. If the conflict between El Salvador and Honduras had seemed war being waged on football, throughout the world, football was waging war on itself. Tensions on the pitch were slowly being eclipsed by events in the stands. In 1964, 364 people died when violent scenes at a match in Peru led to a crush. The incident was by no means the first full-scale stadium disaster, but it was the largest. Worldwide, football authorities took note, not least in Britain.
The big debate then in the newspapers in Britain was about the terribly uncivilized behaviour of supporters in South America or in Latin countries, in Italy, for example. Because in South America and in Italy, supporters were already fenced in, that hooliganism was clearly part of the local fabric of the game there. And there were already fears and anxieties about supporters' behaviour. Of course, a little later on, interestingly, people in Europe began to say that this is an English disease, that we were infecting other countries with hooliganism. So the picture here is very complex, and you have to look at the global picture to get a real sense of the history and trajectory of hooliganism.
In England during the 60s, hooliganism was increasingly a part of the football programme.
And a small boy has now leapt onto the field, in the middle of the field, and he's joined in, and he's taking punches, and kicks and punches on number 10 is Les Barrett. Where has this idiot come from? Policemen coming in from all sides.
Why does this have to happen in football here? Why?
Basically, the clubs lost any ability to know how to deal with the situation they were confronted with, and that was basically that they had a hard core of supporters who were dead set on causing trouble inside the grounds. The clubs, in order to contain this, they put up these terrible fences. They cage us in like animals, and of course once you cage people like animals, they increasingly start to behave like animals.
Where in league football, rivalries were based on regional differences, at an international level, such bigotries could be broadened out, manipulated to dangerously high levels.
The England national team began, particularly in the late 70s, early 1980s, began to be seen as the symbol again of a kind of lost England. And so for some young men, they saw the England team, and particularly travelling abroad with the England team, as a way of kind of reasserting the strength and the power of the English abroad.
The growing spiral of violence that accompanied England's clubs and national team soon made it an outcast in European football. In 1985, Liverpool played Juventus in the European Cup final. The venue, Heysel, was a rundown stadium in the centre of Brussels.
Here we were, about to take our chances against a great team in Juventus, Michel Platini and everybody. It should have been a great night. It wasn't.
Before kick-off, fighting broke out on the terraces. Liverpool fans charged their Italian counterparts. A wall collapsed. 39 died.
Those scenes that we saw just along from our dressing room were awful, and will stay into everybody's minds until they die. Two great teams, 11,000 tickets each, and 11,000 to neutrals. It was an inept stadium, an athletics track, really an athletic stadium, for a big, massive football game. And the people that were responsible for choosing that should have been hung, drawn and quartered.
Siamo entrati nell'antistadio e c'erano tifosi del Liverpool e della Juve tranquilli insieme e noi pensavamo fosse tutto regolare, ma quando abbiamo visto entrare tifosi inglesi con casse di birra intere dentro lo stadio e c'era una porta che era larga così per entrare, più piccola di quella che abbiamo fatto per entrare qui dentro. E loro hanno fatto tutto quello che volevano, hanno portato dentro tutto, birre, bastoni, coltelli, tutto quello che volevano hanno portato dentro. E chi sbagliava entrava nel settore degli juventini, andava giù alla porta, si faceva aprire e veniva portato nel settore degli inglesi. Era una curva divisa a metà e chi sbagliava settore veniva portato dall'altra parte. Quindi il settore degli inglesi dopo un po' era strapieno, non c'entravano più tutti, erano pigiatissimi, noi avevamo ancora tanto spazio lì da sfruttare. Abbiamo sentito subito che di là, dall'altra parte c'era una rete soltanto, di là c'era tensione tanta e da parte nostra, di qua c'erano tifosi tranquilli, famiglie, persone normali, non ultras. Ci fosse stato un altro gruppo di ultras sarebbe successo niente, penso, perché sarebbero fronteggiati, qualche ferito, ma sicuramente non succedeva niente. E le famiglie, bambini piccoli, tutti hanno pensato di scappare in una direzione sola. Quando il muro è cascato siamo tantissime persone, centinaia di persone, sono tutti cascati in avanti. Io mi sono trovato con 2 persone sotto e 2 persone sopra di me, sdraiato in discesa, cercando di tirar fuori la testa da questo mucchio di gente perché non riuscivo più a respirare. Io vedevo il tabellone della curva di là, vedevo poco altro, ero bloccato lì sotto e sentivo gente che si lamentava, sentivo tutti che cercavano ma per 10 minuti noi siamo stati praticamente così fermi, immobili, perché nessuno riusciva a tirare sugli altri e tante persone purtroppo sono morte così, cioè come in questa situazione qui. Anche quelle persone che avevo accanto a me o sotto di me, io non so se sono vivo o no, però è difficile resistere in quelle condizioni. L'esercito doveva essere lì subito, fin dall'inizio, cioè la partita doveva essere giocata con l'esercito perché non c'erano le condizioni di sicurezza per giocare una partita del genere, con tutti gli inglesi già carichi, con i coltelli, con le birre, cioè era già una situazione forte e l'esercito doveva essere già lì, non dopo mezz'ora, un'ora che è successo tutto. Penso che forse sia stato meglio così, cioè, giocare una partita in quelle condizioni è difficile perché con dei morti, e i giocatori lo sapevano che c'erano dei morti, non è facile giocare, però penso che per evitare che ce ne fossero ancora di più, credo che abbiano fatto la decisione giusta.
While football's hierarchy survived, English football was deemed beyond help. UEFA cut their clubs adrift, banning them indefinitely from European competition. Isolated, English football began the long descent towards oblivion. On the 15th of April 1989, Sheffield Wednesday played host to an FA Cup semi-final between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest.
Day started off absolutely brilliantly. Beautiful sunny day. Adam and I travelled over the Woodhead Pass with two friends. We'd had a great laugh, so much so that on one occasion Adam was actually crying with laughter. Walked down towards the ground. We got there about 2:30, something like that. It was just chaos. There was no queues, nothing. And then someone opened the door, gate, and everyone just started walking down it.
It wasn't a case of ticketless fans conspiring to get in, drunken people fighting to get in. All of those were the myths have been the myths of Hillsborough. It was purely and simply arrival of fans coming off coaches, coming from the trains, coming from the car parks in an orderly fashion, and too many people were arriving for the pace of the antiquated turnstiles to take them through.
Somehow, I don't know really how, but we ended up right at the front, right on the perimeter track. A gate leading out onto the pitch was in my arm's reach, and next thing the players come out the tunnel, and that was it. All hell broke loose then.
Those two central pens, one of which had a licence for 1,000 people, the other had a licence for 1,100 people, had twice as many people in them. It was like a vice, and it got tighter and tighter, until at the front of one of the pens, pen 3, a barrier broke, and people went down under the pressure from behind into a mass of tangled bodies.
They're all collapsed here.
Adam fainted. I tried to pick him up because I had this fence, which at the time, you know, it appeared about, I don't know, 12 foot high, and I was trying to lift him up. Couldn't do that. There was a policeman standing on the perimeter track by the gate. He was only a matter of feet away, and I was screaming at him to open the gate. And believe me when I say I was screaming, I was saying that my lovely son was dying. I woke up in the hospital on the Sunday. Took me off the ventilator, and I wanted to know where Adam was. So they didn't want to tell me, but I started pulling all the tubes out. So I made them tell me, and they told me he'd died.
I wasn't aware of anything until about 6, I think, that evening. I'd been out all day, and then I had a telephone conversation with my mother, and she said that my brother was at the football match that was on TV and something was happening. We decided amongst the family that my husband and my mother and father would travel over to Sheffield in search of him, basically.
Pictures that we have.
They finally ended up in the makeshift mortuary My husband was shown a whole series of Polaroids of people who were dead and had to kind of eliminate who could possibly be my brother. My mother was waiting outside and down quite a long corridor, probably not as long as it seemed at the time, and my husband came out of the doors, and just by his face she must have known, and she, in order to get away from the news, I think, sort of stood up and started to walk quickly towards the other end of the corridor, just simply so that she didn't have to have the conversation with him. And she got to the end of the corridor where there was two double doors out onto the street, and she collapsed. I'm not actually sure why the perimeter fences actually went up in the first place. I have so little understanding of football, but whatever it was, I can't believe that it would be at a higher cost than actually being allowing people to escape from something potentially fatal. What would outweigh that? Now I look back on it and I look at it quite differently, because I actually think that in some ways what that represented and what the myth of Hillsborough has come to kind of feed is like this idea of the deity of football. And in some respects I'll kind of very often find myself when I'm talking to people and I'll mention Hillsborough and I'll mention my brother, and there's almost a kind of martyrdom, and that's I find that, as somebody who's outside of football, who actually doesn't have anything to do with football, I find that really worrying, because I think to feel that somebody was a martyr for apartheid, or somebody was a martyr for some kind of human rights, I think I can just about stretch my mind to think might hold some kind of pride. But to think that somebody was a martyr for a game of, is it 2 sets of 11 men and a pigskin, is not anything to be proud of, and I find that really disturbing. I find that disturbing for the future of football as well. I think it's made us stronger. I think that took a while, but it made us stronger. It has also engendered a sort of, I believe, although others would probably look at me and say differently, healthy criticism, healthy cynicism. It comes from our understanding of the way that authorities work, the way that the legal system works, the way that football clubs work. It comes from having dealt on a very personal level with things like that. So our family is really quite cynical of those kind of organisations.
96 people died, 400 people were hospitalised, 700 people were injured, and thousands of people were traumatised. It was the worst football disaster, worst disaster at a football stadium in British football history. And I think that the issue is that it was always on the cards. It was entirely predictable. It was entirely foreseeable. The way in which grounds had come to be left more or less to go to rack and ruin, the way in which grounds were not safety oriented, the way in which the police were not safety oriented remains one of the great scandals of Hillsborough to this day.
The country that had given birth to the modern game now mourned its dead. Horrified by the sheer scale of the disaster, the authorities took action. Lord Justice Taylor was appointed to head a government inquiry into the tragedy. His conclusions proved a damning insight on the conditions within England's stadiums.
What the Taylor report does at this awful watershed in the history of football, April 15th, 1989, what Taylor does is he says, enough! And what he does is he lays down a set of very stringent, tough, difficult guidelines. You will go all-seater. You will do this by August 1994. We will set up a government body to watch over you, to make sure that you do this. This had never been done before. Government had never got so involved. The whole football industry was revolutionised. And Lord Justice Taylor said something which I think was very important. He said, my aim is not to drag football and prepare it for the 21st century. He said, I want to drag football into the 20th century. And I think to a large extent he was right.
Anybody who says they didn't get a buzz from being involved is a liar, because it was exciting and it was fun, it was colourful, and there weren't many downsides. An occupational hazard was there were some casualties in terms, some were serious, some weren't, but 99.9% of people went away, had a laugh, and lived to laugh about it the next day. It was a wonderful way of life, and they were halcyon days.
The hooligan identities began to take over. You know, what was at least as important to men later on was how they performed in this kind of alternative league table that was then established. And hooliganism became much more important to some people than the game itself. So in the mid-1970s, you know, when fences went up at the major English grounds like Manchester United, for example, United fans actually celebrated this, you know, talked about themselves as being animals or being dangerous people who the football authorities should be afraid of. In Britain, certainly, and in some other countries, particularly Northern European countries, drinking and masculinity is a central feature. Relatively unregulated or wild drinking to excess, became a key way of showing rival supporters and other cultures that you were dangerous and you should, you know, people were right to be afraid of you. And this idea for the English that they were the most drunken, the most violent, the most disruptive, the most dangerous supporters became a kind of attractive and seductive identity.
I remember one morning going to see the Chelsea away match. Some guys turned up and they'd stolen 26 bottles of medium sherry, and these guys were glugging back sherry, and they were like a fighting machine when they got to Bolton, and they were just a mad fighting machine, fired up on sherry. Amazing.
Football became a forum where at some club level, but particularly at England national team level, these very kind of raw and narrow ideas about identity, race and nation began to be explored and promoted, particularly at England matches abroad.
Well, it's the conception, the misconception of you know, foreigners' way of life. You know, all Germans are humourless and sausage eaters. All French eat frogs' legs, and you know, Belgians are thick, and it just goes on. And the list is endless. You know, all Algerians are sausage jockeys, and think, you know, that you hear comments like that all the time. But, you know, the history is, you know, we saved you lot in the war. You know, why can't we drink 14 pints and throw up all over your pavement? Why can't we smash your restaurant up? What's the matter with you? Have you no gratitude towards us? And it's just not the way normal people should be doing things. What we saw was a fashion, and fashion cycles come and go. Therefore, the people who grew up with the fashion grew out of it. And it was like a roller coaster ride, and it stopped, and everybody got off except for a few. And there's a few people who'll never get off.
What you get is this kind of complex situation in which the media begin by exaggerating and distorting and developing a very hysterical view of hooliganism, and then the fans taking part of that on board, beginning to believe their own press, if you like. And so the media become a really important central feature of defining and producing hooligan incidents until we get to the late modern stage, which is where we are now, where major football events, the big international football tournaments, become almost like a stage set for the press and media. You know, some young men that I've been to football matches with even say, you know, it's like being in a film now, because you almost find these public squares or arenas where the press gather around, the media gather around, film crews, and they're from all over the world, from Japan and from Argentina and from parts of Europe and Australia and so on and so forth. And they almost define the place where the hooliganism is going to occur. And fans just turn up to perform. You know, they're actually almost there to perform to the expectations of the media. That's one of the reasons why fans now attack the media, because they see the media as part of this process of producing negative, stereotypical images of supporters.
You got it, have you? Oh, no.
So we're in a kind of complicated place now where it's hard to tell what's real and what's constructed. You know, what is really a product of the enmity that fans have with each other, and what is really part of the media hype which focuses around hooliganism.
While England had the financial resources to overhaul its facilities, in Africa, football and its infrastructure were left to fend for itself. A situation which in 1993 would rob Zambia of its entire national squad.
It was one of the greatest football teams that Zambia had ever put together in its history. These were under 23 young lads with blood oozing with Zambian glory as far as football was concerned. They were ready to conquer Africa. They were ready to conquer the world.
On the 24th of May, Zambia flew to Mauritius for a World Cup qualification match. Kelvin Mutale, their powerful centre-forward, scored a memorable hat-trick. Victory secured, Zambian thoughts now turned to their next World Cup qualifier in Senegal. A prospect tempered by the thought of another journey in the ageing Buffalo aircraft their impoverished FA had leased for the squad.
When they went to Mauritius, they were given this army plane. It wasn't good and the players complained. And when they came back, they wanted to have this commercial plane to take them to, to Senegal. But the government insisted to use the same plane.
The Zambian FA saved $25,000, a price the team would be forced to pay. On the 28th of May in 1993, just off the coast of Gabon, Zambia's plane crashed. The loss of life, catastrophic.
I was at the saloon when I received the message that the plane has gone missing, which was carrying the Zambia national team players and the officials. But in actual fact, we discovered later that it has crashed and there were no survivors.
In an irony not lost on the families of the dead, the players were flown back from Gabon in a Zambian Airways DC-10. Their coffins were taken to the Independence Stadium in Lusaka, where a cemetery had been prepared. To a country racked by grief, Frederick Chilaba, the Zambian president, delivered words of hope.
We must start now, this month, to build a new team, so that the hopes don't lie with you still in these graves. FAS decided that we'll continue with the competition in the Africa Cup of Nations and the World Cup. Where are you, the young Zambians, to take up the challenge? Don't bury the hopes, don't bury the aspirations with the heroes now departed.
Zambia's World Cup fixtures were postponed, their fallen team rebuilt. And on the 4th of July, Zambia arose. The Independence Stadium sold out for their World Cup qualifier against Morocco.
It was really an emotional moment, and Zambia went down a goal in the first half, and this mood was just silent, and everybody thought, nah, we're not going to be able to come back. I think the loss is destroyed, and certain fans on the top tier who were overlooking the graveyard in the background turned and appealed to the players who had passed away. Quite a few people were in tears. It was a very emotional moment. Zambia got back into the game, scored a beautiful goal. And all of a sudden, Zambia started playing like we hadn't seen them play before for a long time, a positive feeling. Eventually we won the game 2-1, and was there that Zambia could do it once again, that we had risen from the ashes and would have an impact once again in football.
But it was not to be. Needing only a point from their last match to qualify, Zambia lost. The World Cup had proved a powerful distraction at a time when a nation needed to hope. But in its aftermath, difficult questions had to be asked.
Sometimes I wonder and say, why did they not go by that commercial flight? Was it worth the money we saved in inverted commas, for them to go into that death trap of a buffalo plane and to see their wives and children and their relatives in poverty? It's tragic.
Father, I thank you. I thank you, God.
Chilaba's emotional speech at the funeral, his tears, had been backed up with a promise to support the families and probe the cause of the crash. Yet in the following years, no compensation was paid and no crash report was issued. It was a situation which left many of the families angry with their government and with football.
He cried, yes, because it happened, but one thing they forget is that it's us, the widows, the children, the parents and the relatives and friends who have lost. I don't support football because the government has neglected us. So every time they win, they celebrate and forget about the previous team. I feel bad and hate and neglected. So if they lose, I think maybe someone somewhere will remind them that something is wrong somewhere.
Zambia's loss, like those before it, says little about football, and perhaps more about the society we live in. The game's power to shock, its capacity to horrify, is devolved not from football itself, but from the millions of fans who have made it their world. And despite the tragedies that have beset it, it is this collective passion that drives football ever onward.
Somebody said that football is a matter of life and death to you. I said, listen, it's more important than that.
His quote sometimes hurts, you know, but I mean, then you realise what the quote was all about and when it was made and things like that. He just loved football, and I love football, and to me it was worth an awful lot. I don't love it now. Believe me, there's nothing more important in this world than life. Greatest gift that everyone receives, and I think you've got to treasure it, and I don't think we do.